Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat Saeed Khan. I'm a journalist based here in New York City, covering Pakistan and the rest of South Asia. Bangladesh has just undergone a huge change. A massive student led movement has culminated with the ouster of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who has fled the country. Various members of her government have been arrested. And today, a new interim government has been sworn in Dhaka. It all came to a head on Monday when Hasina reacted, as she had so many other times when faced with anti government resistance. She vowed to use a heavy hand, undeterred by the officials who insisted it was no longer tenable for police to use force against protesters after a day in which nearly 100 people died in civil unrest. The night before Hasina resigned, Bangladesh's army chief told her that she would no longer implement her lockdown orders. Soon afterwards, Hasina's son convinced her to step down. So she boarded a helicopter with her sister and flew to India in high drama. It's fitting that the final act of Hasina, once a global democracy icon, was to double down on the autocratic policies that defined her final years in power. In a 1975 coup, Bangladesh's military assassinated Hasina's father, independence hero Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and killed most of her family. Hasina, who was abroad at the time, vowed to pursue a political career. In 1981, she returned to a country under military rule as the newly elected leader of the famous Awami League, the party that fought successfully for Bangladesh's independence against West Pakistan in 1970-71. Hasina won national elections in 2008 and took office in January 2009, where she remained till last Monday. In those 15 years, her party ultimately cracked down hard on the political opposition and increasingly on dissent, more broadly using arrests, enforced disappearances, media censorship, and digital security laws to suppress criticism of the government. Hasina was re-elected 3 times after that, but the polls were often seen as not free or fair. Still, she retained a large support base thanks to patronage, but also real governance successes, including Bangladesh's much celebrated economic growth story. Many of Hasina's backers pointed to democratic achievements, but most warrant caveats and warnings. Ultimately, Hasina's mission to implement her father's democratic vision was eclipsed by something very different, a vow born out of her tragic past to become the strongest possible leader and to protect herself from all perceived threats. She amassed immense power, and that, as power usually does, led to autocratic tendencies and brutality. On Tuesday, Bangladesh's president announced that Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus will lead an interim government. He is perhaps the country's most famous citizen. Furthermore, Bangladesh's army, which has largely stayed out of politics since 2008, is now overseeing the formation of this new interim setup. Emboldened extremists exploiting the unrest have staged attacks against minority communities like the Hindus, and thus, though they plan it, democracy in Bangladesh may be tough to resuscitate. What will Bangladesh's new government look like? What lessons are here for other countries in the region, especially countries like Pakistan, which are going through their own period of unrest? And very importantly, has Hasina's biggest backer, India, lost Bangladesh along with its favorite regional proxy? These are some thoughts and questions. The analysis you just heard came in partially from Foreign Policy Magazine's South Asia briefing. We will now pivot to Washington to talk to the author of the briefing about what's next for Bangladesh and the region. Please share, like, subscribe, and comment. And don't forget to support independent media and independent journalism by checking out our membership options, also listed in the description. Again, I'm Wajahat Saeed Khan. Now, let's pivot to Washington, D.C. Okay, so to take a deeper dive into what's happening in Bangladesh and what its impact is going to be on the region. When I mean the region, I don't just mean India and Pakistan, but maybe even other smaller states in the neighborhood. And I am joined, as usual, by the one and only, but never lonely, Michael Kugelman, the South Asia Wala of my show, the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, and the author of Foreign Policy's weekly South Asia briefing, which, like I said, I'm a big fan of. And so, Michael, we saw this happening, but we didn't see this happening in such live technicolor. Your brief gives the blow-by-blow of what happened the night of the protests, last night of Sheikh Hasina's exit, and what's happened forthwith. So give us the latest. You're tracking this more than most people I know. What's the latest about this interim setup? Who's in charge now? They've been sworn in. And by the way, where's Sheikh Hasina at? Which country is she seeking exile in? What's her story? So tell us about the government in place and the government which is, well, now gone.
Right, absolutely. And first, let me just say I love the introduction of the one and only but never lonely. I really like that. You should patent that. Sort of sounds like a riff on a Roy Orbison song. Anyway, on a serious note, yeah, this is a really it's amazing how things have played out in Bangladesh over the last few weeks and days. So yes, today, early on Wednesday night, Bangladesh or Thursday night, Bangladesh time. An interim government was sworn in. It's indeed led by Mohammed Yunus, who's the most famous person in Bangladesh. He is widely admired overseas, but in Bangladesh, he's actually a bit of a polarizing figure in the sense that he became a very sharp critic of Sheikh Hasina. He was saddled with legal charges that were likely politically motivated. Does this sound familiar? So he is. I think that he will be. Given that the Awami League is out of the picture, given that Sheikh Hasina is gone, I think that those political parties and factions and stakeholders that will be prominent in Bangladesh's political future, for the most part, they'll be fine with Yunus. So I think in that sense, it's good that he's leading this interim government. Now, indeed, just in the last hour or so, have we learned who the people will be in this interim government? And I have to say, it really is quite remarkable. I mean, the protest leaders had said that what they wanted to see was an interim government that would reflect a wide variety of both political and non-political leaders, including leaders across civil society. And that's pretty much what it is, though I would argue that there's not many political leaders in this interim government. You have, first of all, two of the protest leaders themselves are part of the interim government, which is remarkable. You think about, a mass protest led by students and student protest leaders, and two students are members of this new interim government. That's quite remarkable. There also are a number of technocrats. There's a former head of the Bangladesh Bank, which is essentially their state bank. There are a number of distinguished professors, scholars in there. There also are some human rights and environmental rights activists that are in there, all very well respected in their own right. There is a religious representation as well. Interestingly, there's a senior advisor to Hafizat-e-Islam, which is a very prominent and very large and popular Islamist group in Bangladesh. There is I believe, one retired general, retired brigadier general. That's significant because the protest leaders had said that they don't want this interim government to have any fingerprints of the military. But you do have one retired general in there, which is notable. So that's pretty much it. Again, I'm struck by how diverse it is. Now, of course, we'll see what actually happens. Its mandate is unclear. How long it's going to be an interim government is unclear. There's so much that's unclear, and that's the big concern. In terms of Sheikh Hasina and her party, so last I heard, Sheikh Hasina was still in India. The reason why she's not going to stay in India, despite how close she is to the Indian government, is that there's a extrajudicial treaty between the Bangladesh and Indian governments, and she wouldn't want to be extradited. So that's not that they would do it, the Indians, but that's what's going to happen. She is looking to get asylum in various places. Who knows where? There have been problems with the UK. I think that there's a good chance that she'll probably end up in somewhere in the Gulf, maybe the UAE. My understanding is that Belarus may be another option. So her immediate future in terms of where she goes is unclear. She of course has family in different parts of Europe, in the UK and the US. She
Right.
also has relatives in Finland. So that's all in the mix. There have been reports that the US has revoked her visa. The US government won't comment on that because it doesn't comment for legal reasons about visa statuses of anyone. But I'd say this, that her party for the foreseeable future is out of the picture. There have already been reports that several of her ministers were arrested when they tried to leave the airport. Other Awami League leaders have expressed concerns about threats to their lives. The border is being monitored, I think, to limit how many of them leave. Some have left via the land border, but others have not. So, yeah, I think that the Awami League is pretty much out of the picture for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and they're not in the interim setup either. They're not represented in this rainbow coalition, if you want to call it that. But real quickly, Mike, before I will get to India, you said India is unlikely to send Sheikh Hasina back. We'll get to India and its loss of traction in Bangladesh in just a second. But before that, I'm going to go off script and have you comment on the Bangladeshi army, which played a pivotal role at the last minute during this, when the army chief effectively said to the prime minister that we're not going to issue your lockdown orders. Now, this is an appointee, a recent appointee of the prime minister. He's a new army chief. He has served on the former prime minister's staff. So he's known this family, this regime for a bit. In fact, he comes from a bit of army royalty. He's married into he's married to a former army chief's daughter who also served the regime. So this goes way back, way back. But yet we saw the Bangladeshi army rather, do something which a lot of my viewers in Pakistan would be quite interested in, making a pro-populist, pro-people move at the last minute for the system to perhaps discontinue, but for the people to have their way. Are there lessons to be learned here between the two parallels? The Pakistani army, whose army chief spoke just today, in fact, sounded like he's doubled down on everything the military stands for in that country, versus what the Bangladeshi army chief got up to in the last 72 hours.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the starkest illustrations of how the Bangladesh and Pakistan cases are so different. If you look at the Bangladesh army over the last 15 years, over the period of Hasina's rule, or her last 15 years in power, it was fairly quiet politically. It was happy to stay in the barracks. This is a very different institution than it was in the 1970s and the 1980s in Bangladesh. It was loyal to Hasina. And what was notable is during this crisis over the last few weeks, the army was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of participating in the crackdown, including the order that Sheikh Hasina had given for the army to implement shoot on sight orders. The army was very uncomfortable. You had several retired senior army officers, including two former army chiefs, that basically said, the army should not be a part of this. It's a disgraceful campaign. Those are the words that were used. And then, and I should say that if you look at who the actors were that were waging this crackdown, the army was not very prominent. It was there, it was on the streets, but it was not operationally doing much of this. It was mostly the police, the paramilitary forces like the RAB, and also the Chhatra League, of course, the student wing of the Awami League. They were the ones that were cracking down hard. The army was not as much. And indeed, I mean, you're right. Sunday night, the night before Hasina resigned, the army chief basically said that we're not going to implement your lockdown order. And that basically was indicating that the army was pulling away support for Sheikh Hasina. So yeah, this was a case of the army siding with the people, and it really is a remarkable story. And indeed, it's the diametrically opposite scenario or situation that you have playing out in Pakistan, where of course the army has wanted to be front and center, playing that role to crack down whenever it feels the need to do so.
Right. No, I do want to come back to India, but might as well probe Pakistan further. Are there parallels here between? You said it's diametrically opposite the roles the two militaries have played and are playing. But what about in the larger scheme? Are there lessons to be learned by Pakistani protesters, the Pakistani civil rights movement, the Pakistani opposition, the Pakistani diaspora in exile, the Pakistani free press from what the Bangladeshis have achieved? Or is this a pipe dream for the Pakistanis? Can they be inspired by this? Number one, and are there lessons to be learned and caution to be taken by the establishment over there for what can or cannot be achieved by looking at the Bangladeshis?
Yeah, right. I mean, as I've said before, and maybe we had discussed this here previously, that what Bangladesh shows, and this is very relevant to leaders in Pakistan, is that no matter how much you crack down on the political opposition, that doesn't mean that you're going to prevent a wider movement of the broader public, apolitical, nonpartisan, rising up against the government because of grievances that are common in Pakistan, like economic stress, anger about state corruption, repression, elite capture, simply not caring about the common person. That's what Bangladesh did. And I do not subscribe to these conspiracy theories that there was external sponsorship. There's all kinds of bizarre theories floating around that the US or Pakistan or China were behind this movement. This was an organic movement led by mainly Bangladeshi students. Initially, they were joined by people of all walks of life. So I think that it certainly is a lesson for Pakistan's leadership that you can't be complacent. If you think you have things under control because you sideline the political opposition, you still have a lot of angry. You could still have a lot of angry people who conclude that they're not going to take it anymore. Now, this gets to the thing that we talked about last week, and the two very different cases between Bangladesh and Pakistan. That I just don't think Pakistan is hardwired to have a nationwide mass movement in ways that Bangladesh did, just because Bangladesh, because of its history and its nature, is given more to these unifying nationalistic movements, whereas Pakistan is not. Now, the thing is, we have seen mass movements play out in Pakistan. There was the lawyers' movement in 07, 08 that contributed to the end of military rule. But I wouldn't say that was a nationwide mass movement, right? It was lawyers, it was journalists, there were some others, but it wasn't a nationwide movement. And then today, and I think we've talked about this as well, in Baluchistan, there have been large protests for quite some time, not for the first time, against the authorities. In KP, we've seen large protests against the authorities. But these are separate issues over separate grievances, separate parts of the country. We're not seeing that turn into a wider movement. And I don't think we will, for the reasons that we mentioned and the reasons we talked about last week. And I think that's something that will certainly provide assurance to the leadership in Pakistan, if they feel they could contain these different sources of unhappiness and unrest, not having to worry about it mushrooming into something bigger and more nationwide.
Let's drill down there for a quick minute about those very reasons for those of our audiences who weren't here last week. Now, one difference you cited between the two polities was the ethnic makeup, where the Bangladeshis are Bengalis. They're Bengali speakers. That makes them ethnically homogenous to some extent, even though, of course, there's a different class structure, there's wealth distribution issues, etc. But they are what they are, and they are Bengalis versus Pakistanis, who are perhaps Punjabis first, or Pashtuns first, or whatever first. Then, of course, you cited an important study, an important survey, where the lack of nationalism in Pakistan reflects versus Bangladesh, where the Pakistanis in your thesis are they're patriotic, they're as patriotic as anybody else, they love their country, but perhaps nationalism is a pipe dream over there. You want to drill down on your thesis there and back it up with some data or observations, because I think this is a really important point right now.
Right. I mean, if you go back to the events that led to independence in both cases, right? I mean, you look at what happened in Bangladesh. The Bangladesh independence movement began as really as a campaign against the entrenched wholesale structural marginalization of Bengalis, including the language. Right. It began as a movement, against the fact that the Bengali language was suppressed. So it was very nationalistic from the start, and it brought all of these people together who indeed were and remain, the same ethnicity. We're talking about Bangladesh. Whereas, of course, in Pakistan, partition, much like the events of 71, were incredibly traumatic and tragic and deadly. But the storylines are very different, right? You had the colonial overlords on their way out. They draw up things, and this is how things work out. It's very, very, very different from what happened in the years and months leading up to the 71 war. And yeah, looking at Pakistan, I know that this gets into some sensitive material, but I think that you could make a much stronger argument that Pakistanis are patriotic than that they are nationalistic. And indeed, I had published, and I should probably, maybe when you post this discussion, you can include a link. I published a study some years ago about why Pakistan is not likely to have large youth movements for change. And I cited some things, and one of them was indeed a study showing that many Pakistanis have preferred to identify not as Pakistanis first, but through their ethnic kin or through their provincial that's whatever the case may be. I should dredge up that link and share that with you. Now, I don't want to say, and it's not my place as an outsider. It's not my place to dictate whether Pakistanis are nationalistic or not. And I think that there are certain things that do bring out a sense of nationalism, whether you're talking about Pakistan's possession of nuclear weapons, um, or cricket. Though cricket, that's more patriotism, I think, than nationalism. Um, so yeah, I think it's just two very different cases. And again, just this very stark reality that Bangladesh is a country that is comprised of, for the most part, a sole ethnicity. And I think that that's just such a different reality than you have in Pakistan, where you have identities built around different things, different sources, whether you're talking about, your ethnicity, your province, your language, whatever the case may be. So, yeah, and this is not to say, again, I don't want to get myself in trouble. I don't want to, it's not me that should be the final authority on whether Pakistan does not have as much nationalism as it might or as much as it should. But compared to Bangladesh, I think it's all relative. If you compare it to Bangladesh, it's just a very different story.
I can see how modern current affairs back your theory up, and I agree that there's not enough centrifugal force. You see all these different movements. You see people come out to protest in Karachi for lack of the cost of living. You see the Baloch protest missing persons. You see the Pashtuns come out against the role of the state agencies and their deficiencies in fighting terrorism. And you see the Imran Khan party come out whenever it can, but you don't see one broad national protest movement for all sorts of reasons. But let's wrap that Pakistan bit up and final things up with India. Now, India is literally the big brother in this equation when it comes to Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and according to some academics who watch the larger space, Bangladesh is yet another stitch in the Indian socio-political economic fabric of coalitions and alliances in the region, which is unraveling. India is losing traction in Nepal. India has lost traction in the Maldives. India has lost some traction in Sri Lanka, even though it does have that economic and debt collection initiative there. But when it comes to the Bangladeshis, Prime Minister Modi has a very personal, very important relationship with former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. He's giving her refuge, perhaps for that reason, if nothing else. You yourself said that it's unlikely that the Indians will return Sheikh Hasina, despite of a treaty with the Bengalis, an extradition treaty. Has India lost Bangladesh, Michael Kugelman? That's the only question? Have they lost Bangladesh?
Yeah, so I think that there are observers and analysts that think that India is struggling geopolitically in South Asia, that China is out competing it everywhere. I don't agree with that at all. including in Maldives. I think that the president there may be pro-China, but he still wants to have a good relationship with India, and he's made that very clear. Even in Afghanistan, the Taliban appear very willing to work with the Indians, and of course, the Indians have partially reopened their embassy in Kabul. Bangladesh is the exception. I mean, India suffered a major, major geopolitical blow in Bangladesh the moment that Sheikh Hasina helicoptered out of the country. For many years, India had viewed her and her party as the only viable political reality, or sorry, as the only workable political reality for India. Any alternative to Hasina and the Awami League had been seen as detrimental to Indian interests, just because India, like Sheikh Hasina and her party, view the alternatives as dangerous, as these Islamist forces that could do terrible things. And here, we're talking about the BNP and the Jamaat and so on. So India now has something close to a nightmare scenario in the sense that Hasina and the Awami League are gone. We discussed before that I think Hasina is gone. That doesn't mean her party is going to stay around. The party revolved around her. So it's not a total nightmare scenario, because it's not like we don't know who's going to be leading the next government, the next non-interim government. It may be the BNP with the Jamaat. It may not be. We don't know. So I think what India has to do, and I should say this, another big problem for India, the most immediate problem, is its border. I think India is very concerned that continued unrest, extended unrest in Bangladesh, which we know has included attacks on the Hindu community, could lead to major surges of of refugees coming across the border, a border that tends to be tense even at the best of times, just because Indian border troops have sometimes opened fire on those trying to come over. In this case, obviously, if India knows that Bangladeshi Hindus are in trouble, it's going to do everything possible to ensure they get into India, and with the amended citizenship law, they would get citizenship as well. But if we're talking about large numbers of people just trying to come in, that would make things very tricky and difficult for the Indian government. And you can be sure that that Ajit Doval and the other security officials, the main thing they're talking about right now is that border. So what does India do? I don't think that India has lost Bangladesh. I feel very strongly about that. It may not look good for India, but it really has no choice but to try to open up channels with the other political factions. I think that it may have shot itself in the foot in past years by putting all its eggs in the Awami League basket, but it can't afford to lose Bangladesh. I mean, its interests dictate the need to have a good relationship with Bangladesh because of trade interests, because of border security interests, and because of great power competition. It can't afford to let Bangladesh get even closer to China. So I think we'll see India slowly, carefully reach out to the key factions. I'm sure it's already had conversations with the army chief. I'm sure it's had conversations with Yunus, or it certainly will have more soon. I'm not sure it's too fond of Yunus, given that he was given his relationship with Hasina. But India doesn't have a choice. And I don't think that whatever the next government in Bangladesh looks like, I don't think that it would be opposed to trying to engage with India. I mean, Bangladesh can't afford to alienate itself from India. There's a pretty strong trade relationship there. The border security issues loom large. I imagine that the Bangladesh army as well would want to have a good relationship with India. But for now, in the immediate term, India is really in the soup, and it's going to have a lot of hard work to try to navigate this very unsettled and indeed unstable political environment in Bangladesh as it tries to find ways to pick up the pieces and figure out how it's going to navigate its relations. But ultimately, it'll be okay. But the next few months will be very difficult for India. May also create an opening for Pakistan. Quite frankly, Pakistan I think couldn't really do much in its relationship with Bangladesh in the Hasina era, because there was essentially that condition that Pakistan needs to apologize for 71. Pakistan wouldn't do that. I think with with a non-Awami League dispensation, that issue may not be as much of an obstacle. And I'll say this, that when Khan was prime minister in Pakistan, he actually reached out to Sheikh Hasina. He had a phone call with her. They exchanged letters. My sense that she was actually receptive to his outreach, but nothing came of it. And my sense is that's because the Indians told her not to go there. But if you have outreach from the Pakistanis now, I'm not necessarily sure that you'd have, those in control in Bangladesh asking India, should we do this or not? I don't think that would happen. So that's an
Interesting
interesting
point.
side story here.
Yeah, no, there's opportunities here for Pakistan to finally get in there and do its thing in terms of diplomacy. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have, Mike. I actually wanted to talk to you about another issue, which is the simmering border tensions with Myanmar, whose internal conflict, long running now, is beginning to seep in and across the border in Bangladesh. But that detail is on your foreign policy brief, by your South Asia briefing, which is online. I'm attaching the link to it. Michael Kugelman is the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center out in Washington. He writes this fantastic brief every week, and we try to feature his thoughts and ideas, and of course, challenge them as we, to the best of our abilities, which are clearly no good, because Mike thinks that my introductions reflect a riff of Roy Orbison. Thank God I didn't call you Pretty Woman, Mike. Thank God. All right. Thanks for your time. And I will catch you at the end of next week, Michael. And I do want to follow up about some cricket as well, because between then and now, the Pakistanis might be hosting the Bengalis for cricket, believe it or not. So,
Yes.
yeah, a little bit of diplomacy, cricket diplomacy might potentially on the horizon there. All right, Michael Kugelman, thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.